Now, we have done a few political podcast reviews recently, and I didn't want to stack them up too much, but this one relates to guns. It relates to local politics. It relates to a bunch of community things that matter to you listeners. And I think that you will appreciate this week's guest. Welcome back to T.REX Talk. I have her in the studio with me, an old friend of mine, someone who's been involved at T.REX from the very beginning, almost. T.REX political endeavors from the very beginning, actually, and now is doing a whole bunch of other stuff on the side. David Tucker, thank you for being in the studio. It's a long commute from literally next door, but we're great to have you here.
It's really hard to get here. You know, I had to walk, actually get some exercise. So thanks for having me.
Well, you're always welcome. So as I mentioned, you worked at T.REX. Mm-hmm. You no longer work at T.REX. But we're glad that you're nearby and you're still doing adjacent stuff by every metric. So do you want to explain a little bit of that, or should we dive straight into politics?
Some of the adjacent things that we're doing. Well, I currently run a nylon company that works with T.REX somewhat closely.
So you do some great sewing work for us. You were involved in a lot of holster troubleshooting, problem-solving process stuff.
Yeah.
You're now doing that for one of I would say, literally our closest vendor, literally next door,
yes,
doing all the nylon stuff. But my favorite thing that you did at T.REX, well, it might have been some bending improvements, but my second favorite thing you did at T.REX was you were our first lobbyist.
Yep.
And you got us our first legislative win in the state of Tennessee. So we have a video about that, so you don't have to go into the whole story. We can just tell people to go check out the video. We can link to it on the screen somewhere.
Yeah.
But our first legislative win was actually our biggest. Killing the ammo tax was a huge deal on multiple fronts. Number one, killing a tax is something the government doesn't ever really want you to do, so that's a big deal. But it was a significant Second Amendment gun-related thing, which is another thing that's surprisingly hard to do in a red Republican supermajority state. And it's also a pretty big win for a first-time lobbyist. So that was a very significant feather in our cap in a whole bunch of different ways.
Yeah.
And I think that that's part of the reason that people resented us a little bit for actually getting that through.
We might be getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but yeah. So I think, coming off of T.REX, I think I had done production and then production management and kind of a lot of different projects. And so we had this conversation. We were, various times we were all been interested in politics. And so we had a few different conversations and decided, what if we try this crazy idea and maybe try some kind of new political venture? Maybe it becomes an arm of T.REX. Maybe it is its own thing. We don't really know what we want it to be. And I think we had so many good successes with T.REX at that point. That was 2019. That I just solved
so many other problems.
Right. I think I just kind of felt like, yeah, sure. We're invincible here. We can do this.
We'll troubleshoot this. We'll figure out a process. Make it happen.
Exactly. We have the team. We have people who know what they're doing. We were considering doing a lot more media with T.REX potentially. And so we just kind of went in and started. And honestly, it was just the Lord really put things together really well for that particular bill. So I think I've realized since, and even since we made that video, that it's harder in some ways than we had thought that first year. I think that some very kind people potentially took pity on me as a 23-year-old, brand new to this sort of lobbyist in a cheap suit. And I learned a ton, but I do think that I had some really kind help and that the Lord really pushed us along. There was specifically at the time, the NRA lobbyist really helped us out a lot to get that fiscal note, because that was the biggest issue, right? They really wanted to figure out the fiscal note issue. They were going to lose $450,000 a year. And so there were some backroom deals, which I still don't know exactly what happened, but the NRA lobbyist at the time really helped us get that through. Yeah. And then the last 5 years, we've just kind of been pushing in a similar direction, freedom-minded. Yeah. I did some lobbying on my own for a couple years, and then we moved into starting a nonprofit lobbying organization. Now we have 2 nonprofits. At some point we'll probably start a PAC, and we're just kind of trying to take a piece at a time, do it well, do it right, build those systems like you were talking about, and just kind of improve the way that we're doing things.
Yeah. Now, technically, we still also have a T.REX lobbyist doing Second Amendment stuff.
It's true.
We've had a couple people. Grant did a great job. Toby did a great job. We've had some wins. A lot of our wins have been small. They've been cleanup stuff. So after we helped I feel like we carried a lot of water for the permitless carry bill that the governor was pushing for, and we pushed that really hard as well. But it was an incomplete bill. It wasn't constitutional carry; it was permitless carry. There's been a lot of cleanup afterwards that we've been able to do, and stuff that is relatively small on the surface, like legalizing short-barreled rifles in the state of Tennessee.
Right.
It feels like nothing because the ATF is still going to, have the federal code. But what it does is it gives Tennessee people standing to do various things with lawsuits against the federal government. It does a bunch of stuff in sort of a 10th Amendment way, where we take more control, more sovereignty, more freedom for Tennessee citizens. And that's kind of interesting. So T.REX is still doing Second Amendment stuff very explicitly, very deliberately. But you've continued rolling on some other stuff, because it turns out guns are a big deal, but there's other stuff besides guns.
There are. And specifically in Tennessee, obviously we have a pretty good Second Amendment lobby here between GOA, T.REX, Tennessee Firearms Association. I mean, there's
NAGR
some serious
is here this year.
Yeah, there's some serious lawyers, serious people doing things in the Second Amendment space. And this might be an unpopular opinion for your audience, but I actually think Tennessee's gun laws are pretty good.
They could
in the grand scheme of things.
They could be a lot worse.
They could be a lot worse. They could be better, but they could be a lot worse.
Well, it's part of the reason that it is difficult to get stuff done is it is very easy for Republican legislators to say it could be a lot worse. We have other things we're going to work on.
Yes. Yeah, but so we started off in 2019 and we got the ammunition tax repealed. And that was a big deal for us. And that was a unique tax to Tennessee, right? This weird antiquated system from 1937 or something, where you had to tax all this ammunition, and it was probably patently illegal on the face of it. But anyway, that's what it was. We got that done. And then 2019 ended. We had tried to run another bill as well that was going to protect gun companies from card companies.
Right.
And we could never figure out the details, so it kind of foundered and we lost it. But then 2020 happened and COVID hit. And I think my mindset shifted a little bit to, there are some bigger issues here.
There were some fascinatingly large issues that nobody knew were on the books because they had not been abused.
Exactly.
Up until that point.
Right. So we had a governor who took all kinds of liberties with emergency powers, which I still don't think the law ever gave him. We had people who were dying in the hospital whose loved ones couldn't even see them. We had people who were given all kinds of treatments and then they couldn't get a hold of their medical records post to try to figure out what vaccinations was I given, or what specific drugs was I given. I'm now having these side effects and things. And the hospitals were basically saying, look, the law only requires that we give you a summary of those.
Right. Yeah. So the details matter. When you talk about legal code or computer code, the details really matter. So we had the legislation that was on the books. The law was very clear that hospitals must give you you must be able to visit the people that you're related to in the hospital, absolutely, without question. And then there's a little bit, unless the hospital says they're too busy, like that.
Unless the Tennessee Emergency Management Association or Tennessee Emergency Management Program is in effect.
Yeah,
there's this little line.
It's amazing how these things happen, and I think that they happen through maliciousness and carelessness and a lot of things. But people will write a bill that's going to protect legal rights, and someone's going to add an amendment that completely hamstrings the whole thing, and then that just sits on the books for years and years and years and years. And then suddenly you realize that tiny clause at the bottom completely undoes the whole thing. Yeah. And so, there's a lot of house cleaning that needs to happen inside of some of those things. Yeah.
In addition to carelessness versus maliciousness, which I think that's one kind of spectrum you can look at, I think there's also just a different mindset when you approach law. So some people, like currently I would say the left or the Democrats, tend to have more trust in institutions, and they tend to have kind of a big government or centralization mindset.
They do.
And then people who are on the right tend to have a smaller government, decentralization is good, more of like a libertarian, let the common man decide his own fate kind of an attitude, right? So when these parties interact, and when people within those parties who are all different places across that spectrum interact in writing a bill, right? You have your lobbyists and you have your legislators and you have your lawyers and everybody. It's very easy for a little clause to slip in there that goes, well, sure, we understand that personal rights are important, but what about when there's something really bad that happens? What about when there's this pandemic we don't know is going to happen? Or what about when there's a tornado? Wouldn't it be good for somebody at the top to be able to pull this lever that gives them the power they need to fix everything? And I think that's where a lot of this comes from. You know, maybe it's malicious, but I know very few people who are outright malicious. You know, it's that they have this idea that, well, somebody at the top needs to be able to protect the little guys, the little, whether they, you know, and whether that's the little peons who are stupid or whether that's the little guy who just can't defend himself. It's really, there's a lot of mindset difference there too, which I think is important to understand. And
the ignorance is there. Like, it would be very easy to look at the, you know, the pre-existing bills that were part of the Tennessee Code and say, well, you know, 90% of this is the rights of the individual. And this little clause is just such a small thing percentage-wise. Like, it's an easy bit of bipartisanship to allow the Democrats to have 10% of the bill be written in their language. And now we're working together on this thing. And it's not exactly how teamwork works now, but that is no longer the case. We no longer have that little clause in there that says that these visitation rights and these medical records, there's no longer that, there's no longer those, what would you even call those?
Limitations, exceptions, potentially. Yes.
There's no longer these exceptions on those particular chunks of the Tennessee Code. So thank you very much, David, for working on that. So
absolutely. Yeah. So those were two bills that we ran separately in the last couple of years, where one was the patient owns their medical records. That is something that actually belongs to them, not to the hospital.
Right.
And that seems like kind of a simple thing. And it was bipartisan. A lot of people voted for it, but we ran into a surprising amount of headache, specifically with like the hospital lobbyists. Because the hospital lobby is very strong in Nashville.
If you are not aware, listeners, Vanderbilt is a massive university that focuses on medical stuff, and they are right in Nashville. Yeah, there's a lot of medical industry stuff that happens in Nashville. So
not to mention, Hospital Corporation of America, HCA, is actually based in Nashville. So they have a very strong vested interest in how are their hospitals operating. And it's not even necessarily bad. It's just we always want to know, what are your incentives? What are you trying to optimize for? Who are you trying to protect or help? And in the case of HCA and in the case of Vanderbilt, they're trying to protect their interests, which are, well, we have a lot of hospitals in our system, so we want our hospitals and our staff and administrators to be able to operate in as easy a way as possible, in some, whatever they consider easy, whatever their lawyers and their accountants consider easy, that's what they're going to try to optimize for. And we mostly try to optimize for what's going to create the most freedom for individual citizens.
Right.
And those things are in tension.
They are. It's very true. So we know how you passed the ammo tax bill. People took pity on you and your cheap suit and your first time on the Hill. How did you defeat these ginormous hospital lobby group professionals from the big firms and Vanderbilt, one of the greatest Ivy League universities in the country, according to Tennessee folks, and all the hospital people who are professionals in their field? How did you pull that off?
So let's say three reasons. The first is I didn't. The nonprofit has a very, very good executive director right now, legislative director, Kayla Gerritsen, who is just very, very good at what she does for as far as lobbying goes. But the other two, I would say, probably are, number one, relationships. So we have spent now, combined on the team, we have probably close to 15 years up there in the legislature. We know a lot of the people. We have built trust with a lot of legislators. So when we walk into an office and when Kayla goes in there and she brings her binder on a bill and says, hey, so here's the bill text, here's the argumentation, here's the talking points, here's the research, here's everything about this bill. We've gotten to the point where 20, 30, 40 legislators will basically just trust that that's accurate. And they won't second guess. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but they've chosen to trust our research in a lot of ways. And a lot of them have these instincts where they want to help the little guy. They want to encourage freedom. But they're often told, well, that goes against our interests by the hospital lobbyists or by the departmental agencies or whomever it may be. And so they kind of waffle back and forth on these things. The third reason I think that we were able to make it through was that we took input from everybody and we tailored language very specifically. So at the federal level, we hear about all these omnibus bills. We talk about these.
Thomas Massey always brings up that there's 4,000-page bills being given to legislators the night before the vote.
Exactly. Yeah. And the Republicans do it too. I mean, I think the CR that just went through the House and Senate was probably a massive bill. I didn't actually look at it, but it was just given out days before.
It was only like 1,800 pages. Come on, David, don't exaggerate.
Pages.
It's minimal.
So for the speed readers who can also reference all the other 10,000 pages of code that are being edited, no problem at all.
Yeah.
And that's just a budget bill. They're not even really trying to change anything.
Right.
That's just to budget. So in Tennessee, though, we have much more limited bills. The longest bill I think I've ever seen is 75 pages. That came out fairly early on, and they were given weeks to read through it. And it was a criminal justice reform bill, right? Which I think actually was mostly good. But one thing that we found is that the more, especially as an outside lobby group trying to come in, trying to fight for the little guy, whatever you want to call it, the simpler we can keep things, the more chance there are of passage, right? So the better our chances of passage. So if we can say, hey, the bill is this long, and it says it changes one thing, which is it's going to make it so that the hospital has to give you your medical records. That is so simple that there's really no argument that can be brought against it. So even if the hospitals come out in mass, and I think there may have been, honestly, I think it was between 10 and 13 lobbyists that we knew of who were lobbying for the hospitals that year with those two bills that we were fighting. They can't really say anything. The only thing that they can kind of do is just say, well, the hospitals are opposed to this. And there will be representatives who side with them or senators who side with them and say, well, we consider that the hospitals are some part of our constituency or that they're some part of our
general benevolent
financial support because we all get supported by these hospital funds, and they will choose to vote against it. But if anyone has a fairly serious mindset towards freedom or towards being a conservative or however they think of themselves, there's just really not any argument against it. And it ended up being kind of similar on the other bill where we were fighting for the power of attorney for patients. The visitation rights, right? Yeah. It was kind of a simple thing. It was, hey, if you are incapacitated, so you're in a hospital bed, you're incapacitated, you're in a coma, you're hooked up to a ventilator, and the doctors are saying you're brain dead, right? The person who is going to make a decision to pull you off of life support has to be able to see you. They actually need to be able to look through a window and see you and confirm that there wasn't a clerical error and, you're not waving at them and opening your eyes, but you're actually in the state that the doctor says you are in. Even, we can see that just for closure purposes. Yeah. I mean, you want to know that the person you're about to take off life support is really, or do anything else for, really.
Yeah, even minor things, saying that you have to make the call on this minor thing, but you're not allowed to go into the room where the person is or go into the wing where the person is.
Exactly, yep.
Yeah, the good news on that front was, and there were worse, there were definitely worse abuses of this in other states, but we had situations during pandemic lockdowns where people were just simply not allowed to be with their family members, period.
Yeah. And relatively young people. I mean, I know of a widow in Murfreesboro right now who is probably in her mid-30s. And honestly, this is a big part of the bill. Why the bill was written was because she was mid-30s. She had 2 kids. She was happily married. Her husband got COVID, ended up going into the hospital. He was in the hospital for 7 to 9 days, something like that, ended up on a ventilator and eventually died. And she was not even allowed to go and see him. And she was having to make these decisions about medication and about what's the next step. Are we moving him to life support? And she couldn't even see what did he look like, Not that she's a medical professional, but just it's important to be able to see someone like that, especially when the hospitals are overflowing. And anyway, was it a fringe case? Yeah. Was COVID kind of a fringe unusual thing? Probably, but could it happen again?
Hang on. Donald Trump's back in office and we'll have an election in a few years where, I don't want to get too conspiratorial, but this is an issue where in Tennessee, where we have conservatives voting, we have people who are very focused on the freedoms and rights of the individual, we still had these cases happening here. It wasn't just California. It wasn't just New York.
It was not.
This was happening here. So that actually helps, I think, with that bill a lot. The conversations that I had with people about that issue, folks were very sympathetic about the people. On that issue, folks were a lot less sympathetic towards the hospitals.
Yeah.
Partly because I think they had just come through a period where the abuses were pretty widespread.
And yet it still took us 2 years to get that bill through the legislature.
It did.
Even
Which
with that.
Which shows you kind of the power of the other side, the institutional lobbyists, I would say.
Yeah.
And that is a really interesting one. Yeah.
And I'll tell you, that's been an interesting lesson to learn, because I think at the federal level and in a lot of political discourse, there's just kind of this, right versus left, right? Well, we're the right, or we're the left, or whomever, and we're fighting against the other side, right? And it's maybe Democrats and Republicans, or conservative versus liberal. What's really interesting is that, at least in our experience, it's often not really that partisan. And maybe it's because we're in such a majority red state. Right. Maybe it's because we have 75% of our legislature is Republican. So the Democrats maybe don't matter that much. But what we see is much more institutional, either executive departments coming in from the governor who are trying to kill legislation or run legislation, or these heavy institutional players, whether it's the healthcare associations or the sheriffs and chiefs of police and things like that. They're the ones who kill Second Amendment legislation. And
well, sometimes it's not them. It's the larger institutional, like sheriffs of Tennessee.
Yes.
I don't know that our new sheriff here in Hickman County is signing on with all of their stuff.
Correct.
But
yes.
a group shows up called Sheriffs of Tennessee opposing gun bills. The assumption is, my local sheriff is
right.
signed this letter somehow.
Yeah. The institution of the Sheriff's Association, which has 76 former sheriffs from Tennessee as part of the organization or whatever. Yeah. Same with chiefs of police, that sort of thing.
May not be speaking for the guys actually doing the job today.
Right. But the
assumption is that they do. Yeah.
Yeah. But they also, in some sense, do represent like the institution of sheriffness.
Yes.
Right. They like the law the way that it is. They like being able to pull people over and have certain crimes be.
They like to have as many tools in the toolbox as possible.
Exactly. Yeah. And so for that reason, they don't want to change. They don't like change. Oh, well, it worked for me. It worked back in the day.
Have to write new regulations. Yeah.
Have to change SOPs for departments. No, we don't want to have to do that. We want to just keep things the way they are.
Yeah.
And we see that happens across a lot of industries and a lot of areas. So whether it's healthcare or whether it's banking, I mean, we did have a bill up last year, which we were able to get through, which affected credit card companies and gun companies. And Visa, MasterCard, American Express came out to come fight against us because they just don't want change. So it's not like, it's the liberals. It's just the people who are going to be affected.
Yeah. It generally does break down into the institutional versus the individualistic folks. For lack of a better one side versus the other, that's usually the shakeout.
Yeah. And I think on the broader scale, maybe the Democrats or the liberals currently represent the institutions, which is kind of why we're seeing that shakeout at the moment.
Yeah, there's been a lot of institutional capture over the years. There's been just a lot of, we could dive deeper into that. But instead, let's come back to Tennessee specifically. So I'm doing a terrible job, but I introduced you personally. You keep saying we, this group, this shadowy, mysterious group doing this stuff.
Yes.
They have a name. We're not hiding the name. I just didn't bring it up.
So the name is the Tennessee Freedom Initiative.
Yep.
So we have two. One is a 501c3, and that's a research institute. So we call that the Tennessee Freedom Institute. And then we have a 501c4, which is a public benefit, it's an advocacy group. So basically, it just does lobbying, and so they are kind of sister organizations with separate boards, separate finances, all those things. But they both have unique functions, and we're able to use both of them to a good effect in working on legislation and doing the research side and kind of setting a vision with the institute, and then the initiative implementing the vision usually in really small steps, bite-sized pieces, moving the legislation through. And at this point, we don't mess at all with campaigns. We don't really mess with anything outside of the legislative session. It's
very
just
focused. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and you can do that because now that you're a 501c3 and a 501c4, you're a giant financial institution. You probably get millions of dollars in grant money from Elon Musk, right? Or is
it's all Soros money, actually.
Oh, good heavens. No, this is something that you're doing on a shoestring. based on the interests of people in your community. Like this doesn't take gigantic connections.
Yeah. So it's been about $100,000 a year is what it kind of shakes out to, with all the different fees and all the things, you know, paying basically one full-time person, often having one other person during the session. So for 4 months, and then, you know, fees and parking and all the little things that add up.
Yeah.
We've been getting by on $80,000 to $100,000 a year for the last 3 years. And it's impressive how much you can get done, actually. I mean, it's not as cheap if you go watch the video and you see how much. I think I lobbied for $13,000 or something total for the year, but and it's not that cheap. But still, finding somebody with serious clout, with a bachelor's degree in some relevant field,
Right. Yeah.
who will go in and lobby for us is. People have done a great job. We've had quite a few lobbyists at this point, all of whom have been very qualified and done an excellent job. And all been really freedom aligned too.
Yes.
I mean, that's something interesting that we found too, is that we would go, like when I went up to Nashville, I found all these people who are working in state government or working on campaigns or working, just kind of doing something connected to politics. And they didn't necessarily really want to be doing what they were doing.
Right.
They didn't want to be working for the governor. They didn't want to be working for a legislator or running a campaign, because that's grueling.
They wanted to have a politically motivated input.
Right. They were ideologues. They wanted to work on issues that they cared about, whether that was reforming civil asset forfeiture, helping with medical freedom, helping with Second Amendment rights. I mean, even your current lobbyist, Toby, he's got a huge background in law and everything like that. But he's just, you know, he's been running a business, and now he really wanted for the last, I don't know, ever since I've known him, he's been wanting to do more ideology-focused lobbying. And so now he finally gets the chance.
Laser focused on firearms freedoms.
Yeah.
I mean, he cares about other freedoms. He cares about the freedoms of the individual. But this is another interesting point. Going back to institutionalism versus individualism, there are very effective, capable, educated individualists who care about the freedom of the individual. And because of that, they're not actually ever going to get a high-paying job at one of the giant institutional lobbying firms. Like, there are people that we have found who I would put on par with some of the big time professionals, but those jobs are just not available to them. Yeah. And they also don't really want those jobs. Like, I don't think Kayla would prefer to go work at Vanderbilt lobbying for the exact opposite of what she's doing now, for example.
I'm pretty sure she wouldn't.
They will never ask her. So there is, I believe, a lot of untapped potential, a lot of freedom-minded individuals who have the capabilities to do really high-level stuff. And the system will just kind of assume, oh, no, that person is not a high performer because they're not getting job offers from the institutions. And that's where, you know, you don't need Elon Musk money. You don't need George Soros money.
Right.
A few people in a small community can scrape together $100,000 a year, hire that person to do some high-level full-time lobbying by the people, for the people, etc.
It's very possible. And we should get back to what you were saying a minute ago, but I do think on the individualism versus institutionalism, I think part of it is part of the problem is kind of the fact that we maybe are so individualistic that we actually don't even think in terms of creating an institution. So it takes work to file the paperwork, manage the books, create an actual 501c3 instead of just railing about the fact that why does the IRS have to care about this money?
I could just tweet about this.
I can tweet about it. I can just go be a citizen lobbyist and I'll just tell my legislators what they need to be doing.
Yeah.
It's very easy when you get too individualistic to become completely ineffective. It actually does require working together. So like, I don't have the money and the time and the expertise to go do the kinds of things that we've been able to accomplish. But by talking to people, by having kind of a medium-sized tent, so to speak, you know, by bringing in some people who have some money that they are interested in sending, that have some law degrees or some real interest in politics and are willing to work for less expensive, by pulling in people who have some understanding of institutional, like building a C3, building a nonprofit, some of those things, we have been able to put together an organization that has maybe 10 people at the moment that are kind of seriously involved, and then work together towards a goal. And all of those different parts have worked together, all those talents, all those abilities, all those connections, right? and worked together to build this organization, which is now able to compete in some small measure with the big organizations that we are in disagreement with. And I do think that is an important lesson that I think we've learned.
Yes.
Is that you do have to have something of a team. I would not be effective trying to do this on my own because I have a full-time job, right? You have a full-time job. You're doing something different. But by putting some money or putting some time or kind of offering a little bit of guidance and leadership, going to board meetings, like we both go to board meetings a couple times a year, and we help kind of set some direction for where we want this thing to be going. And so it creates a synergy, right? Yeah. And obviously, like biblically, it's the idea of the body working together. It's all these different parts. Somebody leads, and then other people are the ones who actually get a lot of the work done, and we're able to pay some people because we have means, and it works together.
Yeah. I really like your point about the individualism. You can be too individualistic in some ways. Now, sometimes we're talking about 2 or 3 different things with the same vocabulary in a way that's not helpful. Like, I would say the rights of the individual are paramount when we're talking about legal rights, when we're talking about these things. But individualism is not the ultimate pursuit. Like, I can't be an individualistic dad. I have to be a family-centered dad. I can't be an individualistic leader inside of the company. I have to, have a team that does stuff. So this fighting for the rights of the individual puts you at odds with institutions, but I think that there is a better pursuit, which is a community focus, where you have a community of people supporting this this Tennessee Freedom Initiative and Institute to preserve the rights of the individual, and the teamwork is a huge benefit without necessarily becoming an institution.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that maybe we've lost a little bit of an investment mindset or maybe a stewardship mindset, recognizing that we live under a unique form of government. Right. Even other parliamentary nations and other democratic type nations don't really have the form of government that we do.
Correct.
And we have such an opportunity to invest, and not just to tell our legislators when they're doing something wrong, but to actually practically invest, whether it's get elected to a local office or just spend time working on and tweaking the code like we do. Like we affect the way that police officers interact with us or the way that certain institutions interact with individual people. And that is insane. And I think so many of us we rail against the system without recognizing that in a real way, we actually are the system. We actually, all of our collective will is in a sense, or should be, imbued into these representatives who are representing us in the government. And we don't call our representatives ministers or servants like a lot of the other Western nations do, but that's really what they are. They're supposed to be serving us. Well, if we don't invest, if we aren't actually good stewards of what we've been given, I think you can call it institutional capture if you want, but you could also just say, well, other people have actually spent time building into the institutions and the communities, and so we've kind of given up.
And I would say giving up sends a very clear message, like abdicating your responsibilities is a form of leadership. You're going to communicate to everybody around you that is okay. You're better off abdicating yourself from this thing. And we do have a really fascinatingly unique system of government. And in many ways, it is very broken. Like what do we have? 2 million lines of code is what we keep kind of guessing is inside of the Tennessee Criminal Code, unannotated. Once it's annotated, it's more than that.
Yeah.
But that's crazy. I think it should be closer to 3,000 or 4,000 lines of code, something like that. So as broken as it is, though, the fundamentals are really fascinating.
Yeah.
I heard someone say the other day, and I want to really think about this before I say it, but I'll just say it because it's a podcast, and that's what you do with podcasts. You just say stuff. We are one of the younger countries in the world, but we might be the oldest actual government in the world because so many countries have had massive governmental shifts and changes. We have an exceptionally, even if you look back 3,000 years of history, we have a very long-running contiguous governmental system in this country. So even though other countries can scoff about how America is young, we have a tremendously long and surprisingly effective track record at this constitutional republic thing. Now, it is standing on the shoulders of giants. It is learning from the lessons of Europe. It is still British common law based. It has some great foundations to it. But there's a lot of stuff that has worked way better than alternatives and for way longer. And it is still largely salvageable, not by... I've heard people who are accelerationists talk about destroying the whole thing so you can rebuild, or just saying like the fruit that we see now is what grows out of the tree. It's like, no, there's all kinds of parasites on the tree. Don't confuse those with the actual, what the foundation should actually be producing. Yeah. But we still, even in our very broken system in many ways, we have a tremendous amount of capability. I think it is very much what the founders intended. A few people who are dedicated to preserving the rights of the individual actually have a shot at affecting the code that civil government runs on, even when it's bloated to 2 million lines and has everything, all the institutionalism that we're currently groaning under.
Yeah, and more than that, a few people, and I mean, a few might be generous in this context, but a few people have the ability not only to affect the code, they have the ability to affect elections.
Right.
A few people running very serious elections could take over a significant chunk of the even Republican legislature in Tennessee. A few serious legislators in Tennessee working as a unit, working as a group, as we've seen with the House Freedom Caucus at the federal level, have the power to punch above their weight class in a lot of ways.
Yes.
And so you can get a lot of building effort, kind of the name is not like something about recursion or something, where the efforts build on each other.
Itself.
Yeah, it's sort of a cubic root kind of a scenario where
quadratic. I said the other day, ballistically speaking, that mass is a linear add, and then I said that exponential is the way that you add. The velocity adds energy logarithmically. People are like, no, it's not exponential. It's quadratic logarithmic. You got to get it right. I'm like, yes,
well, apparently neither of us are math nerds.
Yeah, legislatively speaking, I'm not sure what the equation is. I'm not sure what the algorithm is. But the engagement of leadership is an even stronger, more powerful message than the complete abdication.
Right.
Still sends a message, abdication, but not as much as leading from the front, deliberately leaning into these things.
Yeah. And I read recently, there's a term that's going around called brokenists, which I'm sure you've heard, which was coined maybe in 2022, but it's this idea, kind of like what we've been talking about, where do you view American institutions or Western institutions as fundamentally broken? Things like the legacy media, maybe the government itself, universities, these things that have really been instrumental in building what we understand as current Western civilization in a lot of ways, even the church, right? Do you view those things as inherently broken, need to be just get rid of them, reform, completely rebuild them, almost a separatist approach?
Right.
Or do you view them as very flawed, a lot of problems, but we really need to reform the ones that are already there? We don't just need to burn it all down. And I would say that I'm in, as far as at least Tennessee goes, I'm definitely in the Reformation category. I'm not at the let's burn it all down. And I know a lot of people who are, but I do think that's an important distinction. I do think that things can be rebuilt, but it will take time. It's going to take 50 or 100 years to rebuild things in the way that we really want them rebuilt.
Yeah. And I think that this is where community comes back into it. There are things that you can't know if it's salvageable or not until you try to salvage it. And there are things that maybe can't be salvaged. And so it would be great if you had a team doing salvage and you had a team building an alternative simultaneously and learning from each other, because it's hard to say.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. And technologies change. The ways that people are educated or the ways that people consume media and that sort of thing might make a previous institution obsolete.
Right.
But they're still learning from that institution. They're still understanding why the institution exists, sort of a Chesterton's fence kind of thing. Oh, I want to tear this down. Well, why do you want to tear it down? Because I don't want it here. Well,
why was it there in the first place?
Exactly, right?
Is it ravening wolves on the other side? You don't know.
Right. Yeah. Right. And yes. And so some knowledge of history, some understanding of why do these institutions exist in the first place.
Right. Yeah.
An understanding of how good we have it, even our current system. There's so many things that are so good about our current system. Anyway,
it's interesting.
we can go back to actual Tennessee stuff again. But
well, let's do that. Let's talk a little bit. So I think we have some fantastic frameworks that are salvageable. So the separation of powers is, I think, really good, solid, wise. And if you look back after 100 years of history, you can find abuses, but mostly you find the places where, the really bad stuff happened when the separations of powers weren't properly separated. So you mentioned earlier, the executive branch in Tennessee is a little bit overpowered. And there's a couple reasons for this. One is power likes to centralize. It's efficient to centralize power.
Yeah.
And if you build a very large government that is controlled by the executive branch of the state of Tennessee or a nation, that's going to have kind of outsized power, even though you still have the separation of powers. If you let legislative responsibilities, some of those kind of get handed to, say, I don't know, federal agencies like the ATF. Like the ATF can write rules that are basically laws.
Sure.
In addition to all of the budgets and all of the people and all the prosecutorial power, they now have the ability to essentially legislate without quite calling it that.
Sure.
That's not a failure of the separation of powers. That's you didn't separate them enough. So we have a thing here where we have an executive branch.
Well, there's vertical separation of powers, which is supposed to be happening in that context. That should be happening
too, yeah. So we have an interesting thing happening. So my theory, quick rabbit trail. So Donald Trump watched his first term as president get kind of wiped away by the Biden administration because everything that he did that was good got undone. Some of the stuff they did that was not so good, they left for some reason. It's inexplicable, but they did. If he would like his next 4 years at the White House to have more of a lasting effect, he's going to need either the help of the legislature to actually change stuff, or he's going to have to do something kind of clever. Because if he just does stuff at the executive level, the next executive, if it is someone opposed to him, will just change all that stuff. But if he's actually able to shrink the executive branch by giving some of those powers back to the states will fight to keep those things, even against Kamala Harris or Gavin Newsom or Hunter Biden or whoever the next blue challenger is.
Yeah.
The blue states will fight even harder, I think, to keep some of that power and money than the red states will. So if he's able to actually shrink the executive branch by giving pieces of it to other people, like shutting down a Department of Education, giving that to the states, it could stay shrunk for a while. Like it will be very, very hard to claw that stuff back up. It's taken hundreds of years for the federal government to get all of that stuff out of the states up to the top. It will take time to get it back up there again. But even at the state level, you can have, say, a governor. I think the governor of Tennessee is a bit overpowered.
It's possible. I mean, I also have a friend who says that right now, given that Trump is in office, there are policies that we should be pushing, which are 10th Amendment policies on immigration, illegal immigration, and potentially Second Amendment, potentially other issues where the Trump administration probably would not fight us on those things, even if we were to go harder than federal law or to become more lax than federal law or to in some way infringe on federal law, they probably would not tie us up in the courts because they have an interest in advancing those policies. And so now could be a great time for us, instead of sitting on our laurels and celebrating that Trump has won or that whatever, there's been a conservative victory.
It's right with the world.
It's possible that it could be a really good time to enact more of our 10th Amendment rights. But yes, in Tennessee,
floor it.
We do have, floor it, exactly. Whatever the curve is, whatever the math is, just put it all in there.
Just double it, yeah. But I was setting you up for, I think that's a great point. I think more, so if you're listening to this podcast, hopefully this is not just like a conversation. Hopefully this is kind of a to-do list. You could go grab 8 or 9 or 10 friends. pool a little bit of your spare money and hire a lobbyist. You could probably find someone principled who isn't wanting to work for the big institutions and get some serious stuff done. And you'll run into some opposition like we've talked about, but now might be the time to floor it, not just relax, but actually like drop the hammer on some of this stuff and push hard. So,
well, and it's always worth working, even if I mean we happen to be positioned 5 years down the road already, and we have an opportunity now to really push.
It's true, yeah.
But it's worth trying now. I mean, any time you put in, any effort you put in is going to be, you're going to see some kind of fruit from it. So it's worth it. But yeah, okay. So our governor does have
third try. You do it this time. I won't interrupt.
Our governor does have a lot of power. So here's kind of where we are. We've got. I don't fully know why our governor has so much power, although governors do have quite a bit. But there's a few things. So in our Constitution, which was rewritten in 1887-ish, right after the Civil War, some have said that it's the most perfect constitution of any state because of a lot of the checks and balances that it has. But in our Constitution, the governor is tasked with creating the budget every year. So it's his job, his office, that is supposed to create a state budget and then present it to the legislature, who then approves it and sends it back to him. They can make some tweaks. This does give the governor a lot of power. Anyone who holds the purse holds the power. So I think there's a sense in which just constitutionally our governor has a lot of power.
Right.
And the governor then has taken it upon himself / the departments have taken it upon themselves to
and the departments have grown. The departments have grown beyond what our founders probably foresaw.
A bit bloated and bureaucratic for sure. And they have taken it upon themselves to interject in the legislative process and tell legislators when they think a bill is good or bad or could be improved or could affect them negatively.
Yes.
And they feel a lot of freedom to offer their opinions to legislators.
Right. So when you're on the Hill lobbying, or Kayla, or anybody's on the Hill lobbying, you might be lobbying against gigantic multinational corporations that have hired huge lobbying firms. You might also be lobbying against your own bureaucratic officials whose paycheck you're covering with your taxes.
Paid by me. Yes. Yes. A very fun irony of the system is that we do encounter about half of our frustrating opposition through departmental lobbyists. Now, that's not to say they have no place.
Oftentimes they are the experts.
They are the experts.
They're the people who are doing the work. So,
and they understand the little details that I, coming into a system, don't understand. They understand, okay, what's it going to look like to do deportations? What is that going to look like? Or what lawsuits have already been filed on this 40 years ago, the last time this was tried, right? There are definitely huge value adds that they bring, institutional knowledge, and this is where institutions do have value. Somebody who's been doing state government for 40 years has a lot of knowledge. If you can draw it out of them, if they've been doing their job half well, they ought to have a lot of knowledge that they can offer to help you figure out how to navigate a system. The problem is when they just want to be obstinate and they just disagree with you and they want to try to fight against you.
And they don't want change. They just want a continuation, just keep the wheels rolling.
Right. Yeah. Right. Or they're also ideologues and they happen to have a different ideology than I do.
I could name a couple.
Which we do believe there are some ideologues in state government at the moment.
But you're going to have to talk to them later, so probably I won't.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we can do some name dropping. Okay, so then
we currently have a bill.
Right. So then in 2000, when Tennessee was a Democrat state, which I think a lot of people forget this, but
it was not long ago.
We don't have a real stable country. A lot of states switch whether they're red or blue over a 10-year, 20-year period. And there was a period in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and all the way up through 2010 when Tennessee was actually controlled by Democrats.
Correct. Yeah.
And during that time, in 2000, 2001, they passed a bill which gave the governor emergency powers, okay? And in that emergency powers bill, there was this little clause that said he could suspend law, rule, and regulation in relation to the function of state government. Now, I don't actually have really a problem with this because, as I see it, the governor is functionally the CEO of the state government. So if he's going to suspend laws and rules about, can THP join up with some other law enforcement agents at the TBI, and there's some kind of regulation about that, he ought to be able to adjust those things on the fly in an emergency. He ought to be able to redirect funding to Tennessee Emergency Management Association when there's a hurricane or a tornado. Obviously, we don't get a lot of hurricanes up here.
But we got a hurricane farther north than I can remember. So, yeah.
Yeah. But there are real reasons for this bill, as I understand it. In my understanding of what would make an effective governor, there's real reasons for this legislation to have been passed, and I thought they did a pretty good job of explaining what was and wasn't allowable. Mm-hmm. But during COVID, the governor or the governor's staff, our governor is currently Bill Lee, decided that this meant he could suspend pretty much whatever laws he wanted to. So he made it more difficult for churches to meet. Yep. He shut down gyms, barber shops,
right,
hair salons, massage parlors, anyone that was going to touch somebody else. Mm-hmm. He shut down restaurants from being able to have any kind of in-person food service. And eventually, he actually signed an executive order which said you couldn't leave your home unless you had an essential purpose.
Right.
Which not only goes beyond the function of state government, but it actually goes to creating law. He was
correct.
There was no law he was citing as I'm suspending TCA, Tennessee Code annotated this, that, and the other. He was creating a new ban on individual liberties, leaving your home. Right. Yeah. He was essentially creating a law which that emergency management section of the code says his executive orders under this section have the force of law. He was now creating new laws.
Right.
And this is something that we saw at the time was a problem, and we've been trying ever since to get it remedied.
And we talked about this in 2020. Now, interestingly, T.REX was based on the way that essential was defined. Regular jobs that just let you put food on the table, not essential. But because our job had some connection to defense, it was essential. So we didn't actually have standing to fight him because we were not, T.REX workers were not impinged upon, not infringed upon, we didn't have our liberties taken away by this bill. So we didn't really have anything that we could do to oppose the bill at the time, personally. Yeah. But now...
But do you remember the insanity? Do you remember issuing papers to your employees so that if they got pulled over by the police, they could show that they worked at an essential employer?
Absolutely.
As I was reading back through those executive orders recently, I was just blown away by the fact that this actually happened in Tennessee.
In rural Tennessee.
In rural Tennessee.
Yeah.
And I don't know of really many people who ended up getting pulled over, but the fact that we were in that mindset is absolutely crazy. So we spent the last 4 years trying to figure out how do we tweak that language back to where it's very clear.
Right. How does the governor have the actual power that he needs to do his actual job during an actual emergency?
Yeah.
And not free reign.
Right. And so this year we settled on protecting constitutional rights. It's our first carve out. We probably will need to go back and work on it later. But for this year, we basically are just keeping it short, keeping it simple, and we're just adding language that says in a state of emergency, the governor is not allowed to infringe on any individual's constitutional rights. So this would protect firearms. It would protect warrants, search and seizure. We have our articles of in our articles of rights. I think there's 27 of them. So it's quite a few rights in the Tennessee Constitution which would be protected, including the right to worship is one of them. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where we decided to start, was to clarify there are things that are so fundamental about your citizens that you're not allowed to take them away, even in a state of emergency.
Yeah.
And that bill is doing very well at the moment. We've managed to get it through our Senate committee and all the way through the Senate. Mm-hmm. And then in the House, we moved it through a subcommittee. And we found out last week that we had received a negative recommendation from the governor.
Oh, that's totally unexpected.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Actually, the terminology was they flagged it unfriendly.
Well,
it's an unfriendly bill.
To the governor. Yeah.
Unclear. But the chairman told us that it was an unfriendly bill, and I'm a little surprised at that. I don't really understand how it's unfriendly to recognize the constitutional rights of the citizens that you have sworn an oath to defend. I don't really get.
It's an interesting descriptor.
I mean, I have some people who've been unfriendly, and that's not the way that they're unfriendly.
Well, we'll see what happens. But I'm super optimistic about that bill. The speed and the speed that it went through the Senate, the support that it had in the Senate was Honestly, I thought that it was going to do well because it's defending the constitutional rights of Tennesseans. How do you argue against that? But the
lieutenant governor voted against it.
Well, I wasn't going to bring that up deliberately, but the lieutenant governor who answers to the governor voted against it. And a couple people were very conveniently out of the room when the vote was called. But everybody else basically agreed that this has to happen. So it'll be fascinating to see what happens in the House, but I'm very optimistic. I think most of the folks in the House understand that unfriendliness, even if that is a merited label, is not actually strong pushback against a bill.
Yeah.
That's not a good reason not to pass a bill.
Yeah. And they probably have rightly noticed that the bill likely is directed at our current governor, which unfortunately is the nature of leadership. Sometimes you mess up. Right. And people have to correct what you did in post and figure out a fix for it. And that's kind of where we are. He didn't do a terrible job during COVID, but he did overstep his bounds, and it does need to be fixed. And either it can be fixed in his term or it can be fixed in the next person's term. But at some point, it does need to be fixed.
Right. When we find these things, the hospitals revealed to us a number of problematic pieces of code that have to be changed. And the governor also revealed some of those things. So now they just need to be fixed. And it's the job of the people to put these kind of these limitations in place. When you read about every state constitution has its specific, essentially its Bill of Rights, the way that the federal constitution does. It is simultaneously the job of the government not to get out of its bounds. Yeah. But it is also the 100% responsibility of the people not to let the government get out of its bounds.
Yes. And, I think probably King George felt pretty bad about the fact that he lost a country and also that they created a new government that specifically didn't have a king.
Sure.
But it resulted in maybe the most successful...
That might have been unfairly.
...democratic republic that we have yet seen in the world. So these things are good. Yeah. 10,000, however many years of government have taught us that we need some controls, and hopefully we get wiser as we go.
Yes. So it is 100% the responsibility of the governor to not overstep his bounds. But that doesn't mean that we just sit back and complain about it. It's also our responsibility to step up and do what we can. So my recommendation to listeners to this particular podcast, think about how you can do this yourselves. Like, yes, you can point out injustices on Twitter. That's actually surprisingly effective today because of the current administration. But this isn't an invitation to just sit back and do nothing except tweet about stuff. There's too much actual work to do. So it's time for people to it's been time for the last 250 years for the people to actually be involved in directing the government that represents them and serves them.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if you live in Tennessee and you would like to contribute or learn more about our organization.
No, technically, even if they don't live in Tennessee, they could give you money.
They could technically give me money. I don't know why they would want to, because it wouldn't affect them.
They should really set this up in their own states. They should really
start supporting something in their own states. Yeah.
You have a Substack, I believe.
I do.
People can subscribe to that and read about some of the stuff that Tennessee Freedom Initiative and Tennessee Freedom Institute are doing. That's probably the best way to get updates on that bill.
Yeah,
the unfriendly bill.
Yes,
the unfriendly bill.
The unfriendly bill.
Yeah,
it's probably the best way. Yes, and just to keep up with how things are going in the state legislature and learn about tips and tricks and things that we're working on doing, learning about.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating. When was the ammo bill? When was that?
2019.
6 years ago. 6 years ago.
6 sessions.
So, yeah, it's been a fascinating. 6 proper sessions. The governor has called a number of special sessions.
Special session number 34.
That has accelerated our learning considerably. So, it's been 6 years now that we have been doing this experiment. Started at T.REX. Now you're doing it elsewhere. And I think that the stuff we've learned in the last 6 years has been invaluable. I think it's going to continue. I think it's going to continue to benefit folks in Tennessee. And if we continue to document it, talk about it, hopefully other people will follow along, learn some of the stuff that we're learning,
and we would love
get involved.
We would love to franchise. We would love to find people in other states who are interested in doing something similar.
That's an
teach them
idea.
Whatever we are able to, and help them figure out the mindsets and avoid some of the pitfalls that we've run into. Because, we have spent a fair bit of money at this point and a fair bit of time and toil. So we'd love to help anybody who's interested.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, David, for A, coming on the show, B, all the stuff that you did for T.REX, all the stuff that you did for Reliant, and all the stuff that you're doing for Free Tennessee. And I hope next time we talk, we will, maybe people will have reached out. Maybe there'll be a couple of folks setting up franchises in other friendly states to push some unfriendly legislation.
I'd love to hear about Mississippi Freedom Initiative and South Carolina Freedom Initiative and all the other states that have work to do.
Sounds amazing.
So, thanks for having me.